Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me well? It's a pleasure to be here. We're grateful to Steve for inviting us here to talk to you about a topic that we're both very passionate about, brain health in general, but specifically Alzheimer's disease. We both had two grandparents each who suffered from Alzheimer's disease, and we saw them slowly and gradually lose parts of themselves to the point where they couldn't recognize their children and their grandchildren. And I remember as a teenager, I made a vow that I wanted to understand the brain better and to do something about it. And the same thing goes for Dean. So thank you so much for having us here to talk to you about what we do in our clinics, in our hospitals, and our research on Alzheimer's disease.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dean. After that disclaimer by Steve, I think you should just not listen to me, period. No, I'm just kidding. But it is the most important talk you'll ever hear. It's kind of self-serving, but I'll start that way. It's about the brain. It's the most important organ in the body. That goes without saying. But for centuries, we actually ignored the brain. And because we thought it was too complex. So everything was attributed to other body organs, such as the heart. Find it in your heart. No, you won't find it in your heart. You'll find it in your limbic system. It's all in the brain. This incredible brain is the subject of the 21st century. It's the focus of all research in 21st century, majority of the research. And this incredible organ is only 3 pounds, and it's 2% of body's weight, but it consumes 25% of body's energy. There lies the problem. This brain was not expected to survive to 80, 90, and beyond. The brain was supposed to live to 30 or so, run around, try to find a mate, run away from the saber tooth, and die. Not always in that order, but it happened. People lived to 30, 40, and didn't live much past that. But then Fleming and others and their revolution of antibiotics and surgery and everything else really revolutionized survival. If you look at the statistics before 1940s, it's completely different from now. The diseases have changed. Now we're dealing with chronic disease of aging. And none of the chronic diseases is more profound, more overwhelming than the ones that deal with the brain. Why? Because this brain is working 24 hours a day. Whereas the rest of the body actually rests at night. It does some of its best work at night, and we'll get to that. This brain is overwhelmed, continuously working in feverish pace. Remember, 25% of the energy is used by this brain. So it's overwhelmed. All the traumas, all the vascular, immunological, endocrine traumas that accumulate throughout a lifetime affects the brain most, by far, exponentially. That's why we say, if you take care of the brain, you've taken care of all of the body. In there also lies the solution. You saw that there are 87 billion neurons and nearly 1 quadrillion connections. That's where the protection lies. I'll give you a clue at the beginning. That way you're going to have to hold till the end to listen to the secret of how you protect this brain. And there are examples of people living well into their 80s, 90s, and beyond that have aged successfully. And we have to be aware of that because right now the fastest growing population in America are those over age of 85. The second fastest is those 65 and above. The pyramid of aging, which was mostly at the bottom, 30s and 20s, now is turning upside down. And that's a good thing. We are aging, and we're aging successfully. Currently, we have 80,000 centenarians in the United States. That number is supposed to go up to 600,000 by 2050 if there's no further cures in cancer, heart disease, or anything else. And we know there will be. So we're getting to be an aging society. That's a good thing. Examples are there. Dr. Wareham, the gentleman on the right, just passed away a month ago. He lived to a ripe old age of 104 and was fully active till the near end. He actually was a cardiothoracic surgeon where we work at Loma Linda University. By the way, we picked Loma Linda University from the institutions you heard about because we were sick of hearing about these clinical trials at molecular level, and we wanted to see the same kind of lifestyle success that people saw in heart disease and diabetes can be seen in Alzheimer's, and we saw that, and we'll tell the story there. Dr. Wareham did open to closed surgeries up to age 95. He was still rated #1 surgeon in Loma Linda. And he retired at 95 because he wanted to travel. And even thereafter, he was fully active, walking, feverish pace at 3 miles a day, fully mentally active. You've seen him on CNN and many other shows, as bright as anybody you can imagine. But then we have many other examples of that. Jane Goodall, Linus Pauling, Picasso, and many others. Although Picasso, you wouldn't know if it was good or bad later in the life. But I'm joking. I'm an artist, a fan. But many people who have thrived as they aged, and that's where our challenge is. But the big challenge is dementia, the tsunami, the avalanche, whatever euphemism you want to use. That's the big challenge. This dementia is the big category, is the umbrella category. Alzheimer's is a subtype of dementia. Dementia is when you're having cognitive deficits to the extent where it's affecting your daily activities. That's it. That's a blunt definition of dementia. You can't do your finances, you can't do your driving or any of those. It's dementia. Alzheimer's constitutes 60 to 70% of all dementias, but there are many other types. Vascular dementia, Lewy body dementia, Parkinson's dementia, frontotemporal lobe dementia, and many others. But underlying all of these, there might be some differences, but lifestyle is a major component. Now, Alzheimer's is the fastest growing epidemic. Right now in the United States, 5.8 million, this should be changed, 5.8 million people suffer from Alzheimer's. Every 66 seconds, somebody's being diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and actually that's an underdiagnosis. Understand, because a great majority of people who have the Alzheimer's or dementia are never reported, especially in certain populations. It's the third leading cause of mortality and morbidity in US, #1 in UK, #1 in Japan, #1 in many other first developed nations, and will be #1 in US. It is growing at an incredible pace, whereas we're succeeding in surviving other chronic diseases such as diabetes and heart disease. The prevalence is increasing, but we're surviving them. Mortality from Alzheimer's alone has gone up by 125%, 23% over the last 15 years. And that curve will increase exponentially. 1 in 10 people over the age of 65 have diagnosed of dementia. That number doubles every decade until at 85, where 50%, 47% to be specific, percent of population have a diagnosis of dementia. But that's not a foregone conclusion. That's how we're approaching the disease right now. We believe that number can be significantly curtailed and affected if we take a different approach. There are some disparities as well. Women suffer more from dementia and Alzheimer's. 1 in 6 women get a diagnosis of Alzheimer's in their lifetime, 1 in 11 men. African Americans have a 4 times greater proclivity, but the number is actually worse than that because it's not reported as well. Hispanics, anywhere between 2.7 to 3 times greater prevalence. There are different populations that suffer differently, and you see the numbers change. And I'll get to those studies as well. The cost is absolutely bewildering. The direct cost of Alzheimer's is $259 billion. The indirect cost is another $240 billion. Now compare that to the second costliest disease, heart disease, $120 billion. Third costliest disease, all of cancers combined, $60 billion. You can see the tremendous burden that this disease has on our system, not just financially, but socially as well. One statistics that I have to tell you here is that the caregivers, if they're age matched, they die 60% faster than the patient. The families are absolutely overwhelmed, and we must address this. This cost is expected to grow exponentially. By 2040 to 2050, the cost is expected to be anywhere between $2 to $3 trillion. If you are worried, if you're whatever political affiliation you have, this must be a priority because this by itself will collapse the healthcare system and the system in general. So why are we not addressing it, or are we addressing it? Well, we are addressing it in a completely myopic way because of a myth. The myth is that we can't prevent Alzheimer's. And don't think that medicine and science doesn't have a blind spot. It does. Not as much as people think. I'm not one of those conspiracy theorists that says this or that, and vaccines. No, vaccines work. I'm going to say that right here. But there are blind spots. Why? Because the research system is set up in a way where a scientist can get their grant, what they call R01 or whatever grant, if they focus on one molecule. And that molecular approach has pulled us so far off that we've been spending hundreds of billions of dollars on dozens and dozens of studies on 2 molecules. And lots of poor mice, those poor mice. Amyloid and protein, amyloid and tau. These are proteins that accumulate in Alzheimer's. We've known this since the time of Alois Alzheimer 100 years ago. And we've been chasing this molecule. We've been cutting it, burning it, blocking it, whatever we could. And after billions of dollars of spending and hundreds of mouse models, we have succeeded 0%. Not a single drug that has disease modified or stopped the Alzheimer's. We have symptomatic drugs like Aricept and Namenda and others, but they're symptomatic. They don't do anything to the curve of the disease. And we still do the same thing that has failed over and over again at billions and billions of dollars of cost. The second myth is that it's a genetic disease. Yes, it's a genetic disease. Everything is genetic. We're genetic beings. There's a genetic code in every cell in your body. But different diseases have different genetic relationship. If you have a Huntington's disease, if you're a man, your son will get Huntington's. And depending on how many CAG repeats are there on chromosome 4, it will tell you exactly how fast, how aggressively the disease will be. That's a genetically driven disease. But for majority of chronic diseases of aging, especially brain diseases, it's not one gene. It's multiple genes. And those genes don't create disease. They create a risk spectrum. So there are certain genes that really push Alzheimer's. Those 3 genes at the corner, presenilin 1, presenilin 2, and APP, there are genes that if you have those genes or any of those genes, you will get the disease during your lifetime. But nobody here will have anything like that because you see that in populations like in South America where you land and you see entire populations in their 40s and 50s that have it. Nobody in the United States, not many, will have that. And guess what percentage of Alzheimer's patients are affected by those genes? 3 to 5%. So what about the other 95%? The other 95% are these genes. What are those genes? So what are those genes? The one that everybody knows about is ApoE4. How many people have heard about ApoE4 gene? Yeah. So if you have one ApoE4 gene, your risk goes up 4 times, roughly. If you have 2, one from each parent, your risk goes up anywhere between 12 to 20 times. So if you have 2 genes, you should get the disease, right? No, 50% of people with 2 genes don't get the disease. What happened? Lifestyle. There are studies in Nigeria where the prevalence of that gene was much higher. In the United States, about 2% of people have 2 genes. But in Nigeria, it was much higher. But yet, early on, the prevalence of Alzheimer's was much lower. So what happened? Why didn't the gene increase the prevalence? Lifestyle. But as affluence paradox is coming and taking over places like India and China and Japan and Nigeria, the prevalence is going up. Why? Lifestyle. And what's the first thing that comes with affluence in these countries? Meat. Yep. People who think they're affluent, they think they should have meat. And so ApoE4, what is ApoE4? It's a lipid transporter gene. Well, protein product. other things as well, inflammation, but lipid, fat transport. There are three kinds of them: ApoE2, ApoE3, and ApoE4. If you have ApoE2, you really have good genes. They are really good transporters. Your risk of Alzheimer's is actually much lower. If you have ApoE3, it's a wash. If you have ApoE4, your risk goes higher. Doesn't that make sense? It's a lipid transporter that doesn't do its good job well, so your risk goes higher. So if you have lipid transport problems, what do? Lower the amount of lipids. Just the first clue into the whole talk. So there is the biggest clue right there, ApoE4. What about these other genes? Well, these other genes are not Alzheimer's genes. They never are. They're body's response genes, vascular response genes, immune response genes, garbage disposal genes, or what they call lysosomal storage genes. What does that mean? Vascular response means if you have good genes against vascular response, if there's vascular trauma throughout life, blood pressure going up, you have good genes, your body has good response, so it can respond well. But if you have bad ones, even a small vascular response is going to be poor. Immune response. If you have bad immune response, you know throughout life, the longer you live, you will have episodes of immune challenge, right? Inflammation, infections, things of that nature. If your body's response is not good, is not proper, you're going to have higher risk of Alzheimer's. So if you have good response, then you will be more resilient. Garbage disposal, your body's ability to get rid of waste at cellular level. So if you have good response, you'll respond no matter what. If you have bad genes, you will not be able to respond against garbage disposal. So if you're having bad genes when it comes to garbage waste disposal, what do? Don't create as much waste. There's a comedian, Red Skelton. I'm aging myself. She's way younger than me. He said, "Doctor, it hurts when I do this." Don't do this. Don't do that. So, doctor, I have bad genes against garbage disposal. So therefore, don't consume garbage, to simplify it. Doctor, I have bad genes against inflammation. Don't create inflammation. But as much as you think it's your knees or your infections that create inflammation, the more constant source of inflammation is food. The more constant source of oxidation is food. It's a chronic source, so we have to address it in that way. So all these genes are body's response genes, lifestyle. What about those three genes again? Let's go back to that. So APP is a transmembrane protein that's coded on chromosome 21. Down syndromes, people who have Down syndromes have 3 chromosome 21, so they have excess of APP. So that means that they're a higher risk of Alzheimer's. So a Down syndrome person who lives to their 50s, almost invariably they always get Alzheimer's. And their disease starts much earlier. So that means that it's a foregone conclusion. If you have Down syndrome, you're going to get Alzheimer's, right? So we had the fortune of doing research on NIH data that look at a large population of Down syndrome patients, and also looked at proxies for lifestyle, markers for lifestyle. What are those? Blood pressure, cholesterol, and diabetes, which is very common in those individuals. And guess what? If the blood pressure, cholesterol, and diabetes was well controlled, guess what happened? Even in these individuals, the disease was pushed back. So even in the genetic model of Alzheimer's, lifestyle is an effect. There is no controversy. What we're saying is not a belief. It's data-driven. And Ayesha will go over all the data. She's much better with the data. So it's a lifestyle component. So it's critical that we actually take genetics in that perspective. Another thing that I want to talk about genes is, invariably somebody in the crowd will ask me, how will I know if I have genes and should I do a genetic test? I said, no, you shouldn't do a genetic test, because if we don't have a gene that we can actually target and affect. So if you have a genetic test and you know you have the gene, then what? So if I have 2 grandparents who died from Alzheimer's, brilliant people died from Alzheimer's, and I lose everything. In fact, even coming here, I forgot my backpack. Yes. So up to now, I don't know my genes. Guess what I attribute that to? I'm busy. I have, wife, 2 clinics, community-based program, 2 children, a dog, mother-in-law, mother, lots of stuff. But the moment I know that I have an ApoE4 gene, guess what's going to happen? Every time we're going to attribute it to that. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And when we talk about stress, then you'll know the effect of stress on it. So until there is a genetic treatment, why no? In fact, do this. Assume you have bad genes and live as though you have bad genes and do the things necessary to affect the genes. Instead of you know the genes, then what? Go in a corner and sulk? It's ridiculous, the approach that's being taken. By the way, at the end of this talk, you'll realize that we have nothing to sell because everything that you need to do has to do with your living at your home and your community. Nothing you have to buy from anybody. In fact, all the profits from our book goes to a Healthy Minds Initiative movement to go to every community and do one thing, raise awareness about the power of the community on their own health. That's it. We're not talking about, we're not against conventional medicine. It's phenomenal. They did back surgery on me, I'm walking and all that. There's a place for conventional medicine, but that's sick care. We call our clinic and our hospital sick care. Health care is in your home, your community, and your work. And it has to be there. So it's important to start understanding where you can make the most difference. Now, as the poet says, the road less traveled is the green one. He didn't have the green one at the end, but I added that. At this time, majority of us are going to start experiencing decline in cognition. Maybe we're not even experiencing, but it's happening in our 20s and 30s. In fact, the loss of cells, neurons, starts very early, in our 20s and 30s. And that's pretty sad. Your 20s were your peak? Wow. And then it starts going down further. That's okay. Cells, number of neurons is not that big a deal. We have 87 billion neurons. When people say we use 10% of our body, 10% of our brain, they're wrong. We use 100% of our brain, but only at 1% efficiency. So we're not using the total power of this brain. Besides the 87 billion, we have all these connections where the power lies, and I'll get to that. So don't worry about the neuron loss. But if we don't do the necessary things early on, it's going to become MCI, which is mild cognitive impairment. And then from there, 60% of mild cognitive impairment patients go on to develop dementia. But if you start making the changes in your home, your communities early on, not only will you hold back dementia and stroke, but you will have continued brain growth. Don't get me wrong. There are some changes that happen with aging, no matter what. Minuscule slowing in speed of processing, minuscule slowing in retrieval and coding, but that's in microseconds. It would not affect anybody if there's no disease. What you gain with aging is vocabulary, context, and three-dimensional thinking. They used to call that wisdom, but it's not that popular anymore. We call it three-dimensional thinking. That's exponentially more than anything that we would lose. So exponentially more. Are there any 18-year-olds here? No, good. So right around here I say, if you had an 18-year-old child, or you all were 18-year-old, just think back. Compare that 18-year-old to a 60-year-old. They're not even same species. And I have a 14-year-old, brilliant, who's at 13 went to college. Not the same species as my mother. The level of three-dimensional thinking is so much different from a child to an adult. So that's what we have to look forward to, a different paradigm of thinking and maintaining that. Okay, that was the positive. 2 years ago when our book came out, we were asked, because it was published here at Harper and UK and Australia and other places by Simon & Schuster. They asked us to come to London to give a talk at BBC Breakfast, which is the biggest show in the world. We got so excited because right before was, not because of the BBC Breakfast, because they said ABBA would be speaking right before you. So we got very excited about that. I don't know if anybody knows ABBA. And so we went there. On the way there, 2 years ago, Alzheimer's Association called them, or equivalent of in London, said they're too controversial. They're saying that lifestyle can affect Alzheimer's. And she will show you the data from 10 years on. And because of the myopic view of the world that they have. So they cut our show from 45 minutes to 10 minutes. But we have about 10 minutes with ABBA, so that was good. But all jokes aside, we were disappointed. This year, in Alzheimer's International Conference, the plenary talk was lifestyle affecting dementia. The biggest statement was prevention is the new treatment. I was like, my gosh, you were 2 years too late. You messed up our show. And they're spending $20 million in lifestyle. Of course, they're going to blow it. They're going to do it badly because they don't know how to do it. And AARP is putting $60 million into lifestyle and brain health. So now we're coming to the realm. And we don't care because to us, all that matters is that individuals, populations, and families get some control over this disease. So what do you think is the problem with Alzheimer's, dementia, or any of these chronic diseases of brain aging? 4 processes, roughly. Glucose dysregulation. Here, if you take this note, this is actually the basis of most biochemical processes in the body, but especially the brain. Glucose dysregulation, lipid dysregulation, oxidation, and inflammation. Now, they're not separate. This is a closed system. When one happens, the rest happen as well. But sometimes people come to this disease from one direction more, other times other direction. When people have diabetes, they come from glucose dysregulation pathway more. If they have cholesterol, and she will tell you about that data, they'll come from that direction. And we now deal with retired NFL players that have found us, and they come from inflammation more. Although inflammation is the common path for most of these, but in that population, in head trauma and traumatic brain injury, inflammation is the first driver. So these are the pathways, right? So what's the solution to this? The solution is that. How do you affect inflammation, glucose dysregulation, lipid dysregulation, oxidation? Through lifestyle, nutrition, exercise, stress management, and sleep. The 5th one is mental activity that's separate, but those 5. So we came with this acronym, NEURO, N-E-U-R-O. N is for nutrition, E is for exercise, U is for unwind, which is stress management, which doesn't mean get rid of stress. Actually, completely opposite. Increase your stress, your good stress. And that's a very important part that I want to talk to you about. R is for restorative sleep, not just sleep. If you're getting knocked out with medication, it doesn't mean you're getting restorative sleep. And sleep is immensely important, and I'll give a talk on that. But so restorative sleep, you have to go through those phases of sleep. And O, the most important one, is optimizing mental and social activity. And I'll tell you the immense importance and the protective effect of that. So those 5. And if you do this, we say that 90% of Alzheimer's can be pushed beyond normal age. And that's not a controversial statement. So we'll start with the first one, nutrition. Ayesha will talk about this. Her area of research is this. Okay.
Thank you, Dean. Okay, let's talk about nutrition. So as researchers, I always get excited about data, and I think every statement has to be supported with data. And we don't have a lot of time with you guys. I could spend days with you just showing you the data that supports the importance of nutrition and brain health. But we picked a couple of papers, some really relevant papers, to show you, what kind of diet actually affects brain health and prevents Alzheimer's disease. And I think it's important for us to be data-based, first of all, and discuss this on a regular basis because there's a lot of noise and clutter and confusion out there. Everybody's coming up with a diet of the day and, the vitamin of the day, but that is not so. So, unfortunately, this is what our diet looks like. It's highly processed, mostly animal protein and animal fat based, and has a lot of processed sugar. And we want to change it to something like this: a whole food, mostly plant-based diet. Now, let's go over some of the data. This paper that was published back in 2002 actually showed the effect of vascular risk markers, things like blood pressure and cholesterol on brain health. About 1,450 participants who were 65 to 79 years of age were studied. And these individuals had ApoE4. ApoE4 is a genetic marker for Alzheimer's disease. And it was found that people who had ApoE4, they had a higher risk for developing Alzheimer's disease, almost twofold. So their odds went up by twofold. However, if these individuals had high cholesterol and high blood pressure during their midlife, those markers actually increased their risk for Alzheimer's disease more than what the genes did. Vascular risk markers are actually a higher risk for Alzheimer's disease compared to genes. This study that came from Rush University, the Chicago Health and Aging Project, it was a longitudinal study, which means that people were followed for many years, 2,500 older adults, and it was found that people who consumed higher amounts of saturated fats that are derived from animals and trans fats, which are found in junk processed foods, over a period of 6 years, actually had a higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease compared to those who ate fats that were derived from plants. Think of nuts and seeds and avocados. This study, the Adventist Health Study, from where we come from, Loma in Southern California, back in 1993, Dr. Paul Guillaume, a researcher, was interested in finding out the incidence of dementia in the Adventist population. Now, the Adventists have 50% vegetarians and 50% omnivores, or people who eat meat. And he wanted to know, what was Alzheimer's incidence like in that population? And he found out in a group of about 3,000 individuals in that study that people who ate meat, including those who ate poultry and fish, had twice the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease compared to vegetarians. This study, the Kaiser Permanente Northern California group, in about 10,000 individuals, they found out that people who had high cholesterol during their midlife had a 57% higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. And even borderline high cholesterol increased their risk by 23%. So, there are a lot of people who go on with not really bothering too much about lowering their cholesterol level because it's, not that high. It's just kind of in the middle region. No, it's important to lower your cholesterol as much as possible, especially during midlife. The vascular risk factors in midlife seem to have a higher association with development of Alzheimer's disease later on. This study, in the Women's Health Study from Harvard University, 6,000 women followed for 4 years. Higher saturated fat intake was associated with a poor trajectory of cognition, which meant that they had a faster decline in their cognition compared to those who consumed fats from plants. And when they did imaging studies of these women, the women who had the lowest intake of saturated fats actually had a better looking brain. Their brains looked younger, and they did much better in neuropsychological testing. Their brain function was that of a woman 6 years younger. This study, I had the privilege of working with my mentors at Columbia University, and it was found that people who ate a plant-based diet, which negates sources of saturated fats, they had a lower risk of cognitive decline over a span of 6 years compared to those who ate a standard American diet or a SAD diet. Rush University Memory and Aging Project, same pattern. Do you guys see the pattern here? So the scientists at Rush University were interested in the MIND diet. Anybody heard of the MIND diet? Great. So the MIND diet is a hybrid of Mediterranean diet and DASH diet. DASH diet is one that is high in plants and low in salt and sodium. And Mediterranean diet, I'll explain about what that means later on. Essentially a diet that is high in unprocessed plant foods. It's not fish and cheese and wine and, some Mediterranean music on a lake. We'll talk about that later. So people who adhered to a MIND diet had a lower risk of Alzheimer's disease by 53%. Crazy numbers, isn't it? It's so amazing. And even moderate adherence to a MIND diet reduced their risk by 23%. And people who were adherent to this diet, who had the highest adherence, actually had a cognitive function equivalent to a person who was 7.5 years younger. So functionally, their brains were better, and they had reduced risk of disease too. Now, I was intrigued by the concept of Mediterranean diet. I wanted to know what it was, because we hear it a lot, don't we? Everybody's heard about the Mediterranean diet, haven't we? You see it on the news, you see it on magazines. Everybody wants to go to the Mediterranean region and eat Mediterranean diet. By the way, it's not like that anymore. It used to be. Unfortunately, it's not like that. It's been westernized. So I had the opportunity to work with this large database, about 133,000 women that were followed for about 25 years, the California Teacher Study. And what I did was to find out, what is the association between Mediterranean diet and incidence of stroke. And when you break down the Mediterranean diet score, this is what it looks like. You get a high score if you eat vegetables, fruits, whole grains, nuts and seeds, legumes, and omega fats, omega-3 fatty acids, not necessarily fish, but omega-3 fatty acids. It could be derived from plants too. And you get a low score if you eat meat, poultry, and dairy. And what are those? Those are sources of saturated fats. Right here. And what I found was incredible. Every step of getting closer to a Mediterranean diet lowered the risk of stroke. And we all know now that people who tend to have stroke have a higher risk for Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia as well. And it was interesting because it was not an all or none phenomenon. Either you eat a Mediterranean diet or you don't. No. Every step of getting closer to that optimal diet, which is essentially a whole food plant-based diet, made a big difference in lowering stroke risk by 44%. And this is just diet. We adjusted for exercise. We adjusted for education levels, for stress and things of that nature. Just diet on its own. What medication do we know that shows us numbers like that? Nothing. There is no other medication. Let's talk about supplements. Dean and I work in a clinic. We used to work at Beverly Hills where people would come with bags and bags of vitamins and minerals and so on and so forth. And they would ask us, so what about this vitamin? What about this blue jellyfish thingy that I saw on, infomercial last night for brain health? And most of the randomized control trials on nutritional supplements for Alzheimer's disease prevention have been inconclusive, except for 3. Number 1 is vitamin B12 level. Vitamin B12 level has to be replaced in deficiency states, and it has been associated with better brain health. The second one is DHA, omega-3 fatty acids. But we always say, skip the middle fish, because fish comes with a lot of junk and a lot of toxins. So it's always best to go to the source, which is algae. So an algae-based DHA is important for brain health. And then the third one that is relatively new is turmeric. We actually did clinical trials, and we wanted to study the amount of amyloid in the brain at Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles to see, the amount of amyloid through the retina. And when people were given high doses of turmeric, it actually bound to that amyloid protein. And there's research that shows that the amyloid load in the brain actually is lowered when people take curcumin on a regular basis. Curcumin is a part of turmeric. There's so many different compounds in turmeric, but curcumin has been studied. So it looks very promising, and we push that. It's a very potent anti-inflammatory. The rest of them, they're inconclusive. We don't have any data that shows that any other vitamin is good for the brain. And we always say, why don't you just get all of your vitamins from whole foods? It's much better because it's the synergy between these vitamins and these nutrients that make a difference. And there was a study that was released a couple of years ago, and they found out that vitamin B12 and omega-3 fatty acids, the DHA, actually work in synergy to show its benefit for brain health. If one is low and the other one is high, or vice versa, they don't work as well. So the body recognizes it in whole food forms. Are you okay, sir? I'm sorry about that. All right, let's talk about fish. We always hear, fish is great for brain health. Fish has great fatty acids that are necessary for brain health. I wanted to start this conversation by saying that whenever fish is studied in different studies, it's always in comparison to something. You always compare what you eat now to what the nation eats, Unfortunately, we eat a standard American diet, which is mostly processed. So fish, which is lower in saturated fats compared to, say, red meat or chicken, always seems to be better. But if you compare fish to lentils, which hasn't really been studied at all, I don't think you're going to see any benefits. It's the whole food plant-based diet that, is way better than all of these animal sources. And most of the studies actually haven't shown any benefit for cognitive function with fish consumption or even with omega-3 supplementation in studies among healthy older adults. People who have lower omega-3 fatty acids, it's important for them to be replaced. And we all know that fish and most of the animals in the oceans have been contaminated with mercury and PCB, and there's so many publications about that here. And these are neurotoxic. We don't go to our doctors to get checked for these toxins, except for maybe mercury and lead. But there are, thousands and thousands of other chemicals in the ocean that we never ever check. So skip the middle fish. It's important to get an algae-based DHA and EPA supplementation and to get our nutrition from plant-based sources. This is a paper that Dean and I published a few years ago about dementia and diabetes relationship. Now, anybody heard of Alzheimer's being type 3 diabetes? Okay, that's interesting that a lot of you have heard it. I think it's a misnomer. Yes, diabetes or glucose dysregulation is a path for Alzheimer's disease development, but it's not the only one. It's just one part of the picture. And in this paper, we found out that people who have diabetes, they actually have a higher risk for Alzheimer's disease. But in this paper that was published a couple of years ago, we found out that people who don't even have a diagnosis of diabetes, but they have consistently high glucose levels, which is a lot of us, because of processed foods, because of, the instant, rush of sugar that we see everywhere and the consumption of sugary foods, that actually raises our insulin and we get insulin resistance. So insulin resistance has been associated with cognitive decline as well. So one shouldn't wait for us to have a diagnosis of diabetes to be careful. It's important to pay attention to insulin resistance. And what causes insulin resistance? Mostly saturated fats and processed foods. All right. And so to kind of come to a conclusion of what an ideal diet for the brain looks like, it's a whole food plant-based diet. And one should work towards elimination of meat, poultry, and dairy. Now, we believe in progress. Sometimes these statements seem harsh, especially when we actually work half a day in a community clinic where people mostly don't have any access to health care, they don't have health insurance. And for us to go there and ask people to become, whole food plant-based overnight, that's not going to happen. There are people who don't even know what beans are, and they live off of fast food because they're so busy raising a family. So as far as progress is concerned, find out where you are today and go towards the next step of that optimal diet. I think that's the most important message that we have to give to communities. Specific consumption of certain foods are great for the brain. What are they? Greens, berries, and beans. Greens because they're an incredible source of anti-inflammatory compounds, berries as well, and beans have complex resistant starches that are a great source of energy, protein, and they also keep sugar in your gut. They have what we call the second meal effect. Say, for example, you ate a bean burrito in the morning, which is fabulous, but then something happened. By accident, you had a donut. We're not going to go into the details of it. Now, the beans in the burrito actually keeps the sugar in the donut inside your gut, and it doesn't let it go into your circulation to cause a sugar spike, where your brain just goes haywire and it causes inflammation. So eating beans on a regular basis is one of the best things we can do for our brain. And if we look at the blue zones in the world, these are areas that have the longest living populations, who have the least amount of disease, including dementia. One of the most important factors in the diet is beans. All right. So an everyday meal would look like something you guys had for lunch today. Green leafy vegetables, cruciferous vegetables, other vegetables, berries, nuts and seeds, beans and lentils, whole grains, herbs and spices, tea and coffee. And then working towards eliminating sugar. And when I say sugar, sugar not in fruit, because that is actually bound with so many vitamins and nutrients and fiber. This sugar is the white sugar that we see everywhere and in pastries and sweets. Cheese and dairy, because they're a very high source of saturated fats, and extracted plant oils, especially tropical ones, coconut oil and palm oil, because they're more than 90% saturated fats. It clogs the artery the same way that saturated fats from animal products are concerned. So, in summary, whole food plant-based diet prevents neurodegenerative diseases of the brain and neurovascular diseases as well, like stroke. Saturated fats are associated with insulin resistance and inflammation, and sugar consumption, pure processed sugar, is associated with inflammation in the brain. And Dean will talk about exercise.
I don't know if the clapping is for you or for me, but I'll take it for me. Yeah. I'm joking.
It's for you. It's for you.
Okay. So exercise. Exercise is important. We all know this. But let me tell you how important. Whereas nutrition, sleep, and stress management creates the environment for the brain to grow, exercise and mental activity actually grow the brain, actually allow those neurons to connect. And it's critical that we incorporate this into our daily life. There have been many studies, many. As Ayesha said, if we would have put all the papers into this talk, you would be here till tomorrow. In fact, one of the things that we found when we published the book, Harper kept coming back and saying, you have to cut down on the citations. You have to cut down on the citation. So we had to put 300 of them in the website for people to check in the website. Because they said if the book is, we didn't even know this, if the book is past a certain thickness, there's an eye test that people walk by the book. So we had to cut down on the citation. Things I didn't know before. But for exercise, there are profound amount of data of the effect of exercise on brain. Framingham longitudinal study, one of the longest, most valid studies in the country. Daily brisk walk, my favorite form of exercise. Daily brisk walk. So none of you have an excuse. Daily brisk walk, some of you, can reduce your chance of developing Alzheimer's by 40%. This has been repeated in several studies. So a daily brisk walk. Why do I say brisk walk? I'm not a big fan of running and some of the traumatic exercises, but a walk, biking, a treadmill or even a recumbent bike is my favorite form of exercise. If I was Secretary of Health and Human Services, which I would be fired the next day for this edict, I would connect every TV to a recumbent bike, so nobody's TV would be working unless they're moving the bike. You're clapping now, you wouldn't be clapping the day after. I know that all these letters would be going out. So, other studies, physical activity and risk of cognitive decline, and meta-analysis of prospective studies. 2010, 34,000 people, high level of physical activity, reduced your cognitive decline by 38%. Even moderate exercise reduced it by 35% or so. That's remarkable. When have you heard about the fact that, I'm going to repeat this, that cognitive decline and dementia can be prevented? If all these papers exist that independently exercise does this, not small studies, Framingham Health Study, Adventist Health Study, California Teachers Study, these humongous studies, retrospective and prospective, that show this, why is nobody talking about it? You know why? Because there's no money made from kale, broccoli, and potatoes. There's no money made from brisk walk. Literally. So this is not conspiracy. Nobody's doing that, but it's not as sexy. That's where I come in. So, physical activity in elderly is associated with improved executive function and processing speed. Processing speed is something that's affected as we get older. Not a lot. Like I said, if you avoid pathology, it's minuscule. You won't notice it. But exercise reduced the decline in cognitive function, especially dementia, and specifically executive by 60%. That's remarkable. Exercise and memory decline, again, other studies that show the same thing. Flow of blood to the frontal lobe. It affects blood flow to the frontal lobe. It affects glucose metabolism. It affects even lipid metabolism in your body, but also in your brain as well. So in many different ways, it affects the brain in a positive way. BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. When I was at NIH, one of the studies we did at the time, this is 2001, was there was a neurodegenerative patient. We put BDNF and GDNF into the brain through these pumps to look at the regrowth of neurons and all of that. Didn't work. Hasn't worked. How many years later? You know what increases BDNF? Exercise significantly. This is instead of putting a pump into your brain, go for a brisk walk. Effective C-reactive protein, inflammatory markers. The one factor that reduces inflammatory markers better than anything else is exercise. The one factor that increases your good cholesterol, HDL, exercise. So we don't need to go into study after study, 47%, 50% reduction in cognitive decline. So the next question is, what kind of exercise? Here I introduce my favorite statement in English language. It's the only language I know, so in language. It's, to the best of our knowledge today, there seems to be a need for certainty in those searching the internet or Dr. Google. That somebody must say that this is going to stop this, or 100% data, or they say, oh, it's the retrospective study and so on and so forth. No. To the best of our knowledge means that there's enough data that gives us a profound amount of certainty for a given direction. And beauty of science is it's not absolute, it's open to challenge, but it's good enough, and look what we've done with that. The plane we came in was along those lines, To the best of our knowledge, this is how aerodynamics works. To the best of our knowledge, this is how you create food. This is the best of our knowledge, this is... So I'm emphasizing that as part of what we do is myth busting in science. There's a lot of noise out there, this keto diet and South Beach diet and all these. These are all confirmation biases. But the data, profound data, shows that exercise, there are three types that are effective. First of all, every time a patient comes to us, I say, you have to exercise. Oh, I do. I plenty of exercise. Don't even worry about me. I say, what do you do? I walk the neighborhood. I garden. I walk the dog. I said, those are fantastic, but those are just meditation. Aerobic exercise, more than you thought. So that brisk walk, it should get you tired. You don't have to count your pulse and subtract your age, none of that. If you have difficulty finishing a sentence, that's good aerobic exercise. And how much? Work your way towards. That's another phrase we use. We're not absolutist. We're not binary. Work your way towards. And small increments of work. 25 to 30 minutes of significant aerobic exercise, 4 to 5 days a week. If you haven't done that kind of exercise in years, start with 5 minutes of brisk walking, and that's it. For 2 months. You didn't get to this point over weeks. Don't try to get out of it over weeks. So you should be getting to 25 minutes to 30 minutes of brisk walking 4 to 5 days a week over 6 months to 8 months period. And then it will be a successful behavior. New Year resolutions don't work. The second thing is, even if you've worked out or exercised half an hour, but yet you sat for 8 hours, studies show that that negated that benefit. There's nothing as bad as recumbency, just sitting in one spot. Right now, everybody wants to get up now. Yeah, but no, you've been working out the whole time. I'm seeing that. That's good. But yes. So move throughout the day, every hour. Get up. Put all of these smartphones or watches have these bells that get after an hour it rings. Get up, stretch, walk to the kitchen. Well, maybe not the kitchen, to the bathroom and other places. So walk often. Third was a surprising one. Initially, we had to question it because in science there's directionality. Correlation does not causation make. What does that mean? It means that the direction might be the opposite direction. But what we found, not us, others as well, that leg strength was associated with brain health. Bigger brains, bigger legs, bigger brains. So we thought maybe the people are healthier, their brains are healthier, therefore their legs are healthier. No, actually the other way was true as well. People who worked out their legs actually developed better brain health. And it makes sense. The biggest pump in your body is not your heart. It's your legs. The veins in your legs don't have muscle. Something has to press them to get the blood up. What is that? It's the leg muscles. So that means more blood to the brain. The biggest source of metabolism or homeostasis of metabolism is legs. So bigger legs, better management of glucose, all of these things. And thirdly, bigger legs meant more exercise, more stability, less falls, all of those things that actually get people who are older into the hospitals, and more BDNF for the brain. So if you're getting up, if you don't have knee problems, little mini squats, biking, that recumbent bike on TV thing, actually it works. So get those legs strong, because just the other variable that I spoke about, which is fall risk, goes down significantly. So those three things as far as exercise is concerned. The next thing is stress. And stress is a very, very important factor. Now, stress does many things. One is it shrinks the brain. It actually creates significant damage to the prefrontal cortex. And stress actually affects all your hormonal immunological systems. Let me tell you how. So your limbic system is one of the oldest part of the brain. It's the emotional brain. The limbic system's job is part of it is memory, but bigger part is emotional interpretation. Your limbic system interprets a piece of act. Now remember, it's your interpretation. The same act could be stressful for one person, but pleasant for the other person. So there's an interpretive component to that. So this person interprets this behavior and deems it stressful. The message goes to the hypothalamus, and there's a direct path to the hypothalamus, then to the pituitary. And those of you who know physiology, pituitary is the center of all hormonal, endocrine, every aspect of your body. Your thyroid gland is controlled from that. Your insulin is controlled from there. Your growth hormone is controlled. Everything. Immune system is controlled from there. So the interpretation that takes place in your limbic system goes to the hypothalamus, to the pituitary, and what's released is dependent on how you've interpreted it. So good stress and bad stress are important. Initially, we felt very uncomfortable about this because scientists, stress and stress interpretation seems like a soft concept. But it's not, it's the brain. So where do we start? I'll get past this. Lots of studies that show stress reduces BDNF, reduces the size of the hippocampus, affects the part of the brain that are associated with attention, actually shrinks those parts of the brain. And studies like for meditation that have shown to actually increase attention and even increase your ability to attend and memorize. We know all of these studies. So how do you start the process forward? Interpreting. In our household, we always tell the story. My mother was a politician, and she was with those prim and proper, the gloves and the chandeliers and all that. She comes to two neurologists' home where there's a whiteboard in every room, including an 8-foot by 6-foot whiteboard in our bedroom. She almost has a seizure. And but whiteboards are important because we get up and write down. One of the things we do with our two kids as well, good stress and bad stress. Specifically, this is good stress for me, this is bad stress for me. And identify your stress. Lifetimes people go through life without ever addressing or identifying the most important thing, what is increasing your stress and what's actually good stress. Now let me tell you what good stress is. So good stress is the kind of stress, and it's the most important thing. When I get to optimize, I'll tell you this is good stress. Good stress is the kind of stress that's driven by your purpose, has a direction, is time-bound, you can see the light at the end of the tunnel, and that's not a train coming at you, and it's well-circumscribed behavior that you have instituted. That's purpose. That's critical. Without that, nothing else works. So that's good stress, and it's important for you to define that and increase it throughout life. Whiteboards. And bad stress is the opposite. You're doing something repetitive that's not yours, that doesn't seem to have an end, and increases stress. And then your limbic system interprets it as bad, and all those chemical changes that you think that we talked about happen. And that's why the brain shrinks. That's why the thyroid gland is affected by stress. That's why your growth hormone is affected by stress. These studies are all out there. So perception is critical. And we talked about bad stress, and define your bad stress and try to reduce it. So some steps towards stress management, not stress reduction, stress management. Identify the stressors, we said that. Stop multitasking. There is no such thing as multitasking. And when I say this, people say, oh, it's not a big deal. It is a huge deal. Multitasking is part of our DNA in this culture. I'm in New York City, for God's sakes. There is no such thing as multitasking. It's doing multiple things badly and creating urgency and redundancy and urgency. And that creates a subclinical stress level that accumulates in your body. So it's critical to eliminate that. It doesn't mean you don't do multiple things. For my goodness, we do multiple things. But everything should be in silos, in their own ways. Third is first things first, prioritize. So these are all management tools, aren't they? But that has to be where we start. And fourthly, as a separate thing, meditate. Whatever that means to you. By the way, for us, meditation doesn't mean sitting in a corner and crossing legs and all that. I respect that. I love that. That's not me, as you could have guessed. For me, it's walking, exercising, and just a walk with a cadence, with a count. And with our kids, we do mindful breathing, where you sit and you teach them how to breathe in and out, cleansing, and then focusing on that. And initially, when I was at NIH, I would make fun of this. I truly would. And I'm still making fun of some of the things, but not this. This is profound. Imagine kids being aware of their emotions, being aware of their stress levels, and managing that. When did I teach that in school? So that's a critical thing. And by the way, just 3 minutes twice a day. Because once you become good at it, then you can actually take that sense into your day. And more importantly, everybody says, I can't meditate because I lose focus. No, that act of losing focus is actually the best part. If at first you can only focus on your breath for 5 seconds, that's fine. Your job is now to move it to 7 seconds, then to 9 seconds, then to 10 seconds. And that act actually rebuilds the focus centers of the brain. Let me tell you about the focus centers of the brain. The first part of the brain that's affected as we age is not your memory centers. You know where it is? Your focus centers. So if you want to, and the first part of the brain that's significantly affected in Alzheimer's is the focus centers. And thirdly, the good news, it's the part of the brain that you can affect, you can improve. So that's the benefit of meditation, mindfulness, or whatever you're doing that can create that focus and relaxation. Sleep. So Ayesha will speak about sleep.
Let's talk about sleep. Who sleeps like that anymore? No one. I just love that picture. That's why I put it there. Okay, sleep. Sleep is the most important time of the day. That sounds funny because we're completely unaware of what's happening, but it is the most important time of the day for the brain. Remember when Dean said the brain is the most active organ in the body? It consumes 25% of your body's energy constantly. It's always awake. We sleep, but the brain continuously works. So because it's a very active organ, it produces a lot of waste products. It is under a lot of pressure. It actually is continuously trying to process things. So it needs a process to get rid of all the garbage material and to restore. And when does that happen? During sleep. Now, it's the most important thing to remember about sleep is two functions. When we sleep, two things happen. The first thing that happens is consolidation of memory, which means that all of the information that we're gathering during the day, say, I've been up since 7 in the morning and I've been talking to a lot of you and I've been trying to remember names, I've been learning new things, I've been looking at all these beautiful books out here. All of that information just goes and lies on a notepad of some sort, okay? Just like scribbles. When I sleep, all of that information goes into a metaphorical file, folder, and cabinet so that it's easier for me to retrieve it tomorrow and the day after, later on. So the information is consolidated during sleep. Now, when people don't sleep, that information doesn't go into the file folder and cabinets and it's lost. And that's why a lot of people have memory problems, short-term memory recall, problem-solving issues, making good decisions in judgment if they have sleep deprivation. Shift workers, like nurses who work in the ICU, or cops, or people who are basically challenging their circadian rhythm, they experience a lot of cognitive impairment. And in this particular study, they showed that long-term night shift workers who actually have disruption of their sleep cycle, which suppresses their melatonin production, were at a higher risk of cognitive impairment. This study actually showed that sleep deprivation causes microglia, which are brain cells, they're called the janitor cells, to go nuts. So this is the second function of sleep. The first one was memory consolidation. The second one is detoxification. The brain detoxifies itself during sleep. We have microglia, small little janitor cells that go and start eating away at the broken parts of the brain, the damaged parts of the brain. But when we don't sleep, and during chronic sleep deprivation, these cells actually start eating away at the healthy parts of the brain. And that's why chronic sleep deprivation has been associated with a smaller sized brain. The brain actually shrinks with sleep deprivation. And that's what this study actually showed. Obstructive sleep apnea. Any disorder that disrupts the architecture of sleep, such as sleep apnea, puts us at an increased risk for Alzheimer's disease. In a study at Florida University, they found out among 13,000 participants that sleep apnea increased the risk of Alzheimer's by 70%. And Dean and I are actually studying that in another large nationwide sample where we found out that when people have sleep apnea, but they were diagnosed early on and they started using CPAP machine, they were able to lower their risk of Alzheimer's disease. So treatment made a big difference. Sleep apnea is an epidemic. Not only does it affect brain health, it actually increases the risk for myocardial infarction, heart attacks, for diabetes, eating patterns, behaviors, depression, mood. So identification of sleep apnea is critical. And again, people ask us, what about medication? If I can't sleep, or is it okay if I take medication that the doctors give me? And we say, yes, it's okay. Short-term medications are fine because it's important for people to feel rested. But medication is not a long-term solution. The long-term solution is always things like cognitive behavioral therapy or sleep hygiene mechanisms that need to be instituted as soon as possible. And remember, people quit on cognitive behavioral therapy and sleep hygiene. Sleep hygiene is another long talk, which essentially means, identification of environmental factors that make you sleep better. Your bedroom should be like a spa. It literally should be like a spa. It's the best place where your brain detoxifies itself. So finding out the right temperature, of what temperature is perfect for you. Even bed sheets, neck pillow, mattress comfort, what you eat before sleep, making sure you don't eat food right before going to bed, because as we grow older, regardless of the type of food we eat, the food digestion slows down, and the process of digestion actually keeps us awake. And the food that we eat revs us up and people can't sleep. And then cognitive behavioral therapy for running thoughts, not being able to shut down your mind. What do? Having things like a small little notebook on your nightstand to write down everything, or maybe in that whiteboard that Dean was talking about, to kind of getting things off of your mind and transferring it to something else to calm your mind down. Mindful breathing, all of these are parts of sleep hygiene. So we cannot emphasize how important sleep is, and especially making sure that one goes through each and every stage of sleep, because those are responsible for memory consolidation and detoxification. So in summary, sleep apnea identification is critically important because it raises risk for Alzheimer's disease. It cleanses the brain, and it consolidates memory. And all of these have to be done at the same time. Dean?
By the way, we're not sponsored by bad mattresses or whiteboards.
You can take names.
So, yeah. So the next thing is optimizing mental activity. As much as we would like to say nutrition is the most important thing, or exercises, because our research is exercise, nutrition, and all these other factors, mental activity is by far the most important. Because of those connections, the cognitive reserve we talked about. Now each neuron, 87 billion neurons, each neuron can make a couple of connections or 30,000 connections. The analogy I give is, it's obviously a false analogy, but it's it helps you picture it. Here's a piece of memory and you're trying to get to it. there are two connections, axons, connected to that piece of memory. At 20, you did something, a bad night's sleep or a good night or whatever, that one is severed. At 30, you had your head bumped into something and this one was severed. It's more complex than that. What happened to that memory? Gone forever. Now, imagine 30,000 connections to that. What's going to get rid of that memory? Nothing. I mean, short of a huge stroke, nothing. That's where the resilience comes in. And there are many studies that have actually shown this. So this is the part that I want everybody to focus on. There are many, many studies, and I think our study is in here as well. The London taxi driver study, who knows about this study? There. So it's a very interesting study. By the way, this is pre-GPS. This is when I was driving probably for Domino's and trying to make money for my college. And it was difficult back then. Anybody who knew they had these books that you say J7 and you would find the place. You can't imagine how many people got free pizzas because of my driving and directions in DC, in Virginia, Fairfax. But nonetheless, it was very complex. Now take that, go to London. And if anybody's been in London, it's horrendous. It's not like Chicago, Rush Street, it's much more chaotic. And more importantly, what it is at that time, they had to memorize, the taxi drivers for the test, every street, every number. I mean, that's incredibly complex. And the test was pretty complicated. They had to take it. So they said, let's do this test. We do neuropsych testing beforehand, imaging and volumetrics beforehand and after the study period, those who passed. And they looked at the brains of those who passed before and after. These are not 20-year-olds. These are people in their 50s and around that age average. And guess what they saw? That their brains actually grew. So we thought that your brain's supposed to shrink after the 20s, right? Especially their hippocampus, the part of the memory associated with memory, actually grew. Now, let me tell you what growth. To see the growth on MRI volumetrics, it's significant. Their brains actually grew from just studying for the taxi driver thing. So that's remarkable. And they did much better in neuropsychological testing after the study period than before. And that was just one event, one period of studying. Imagine if you're doing that throughout life or you're doing it for a protracted period of time. Occupational complexity is another thing. The most protective factor for brain health is occupational complexity. The more complex your job, the more protected you are. By far, more than any other variable for the brain is occupational complexity. So this is our study. We did a meta-analysis, and anybody who's done research, they know how painful meta-analyses are. First of all, you have to collect everybody else who's done the research on the field. They have to respect you, you have to give you the data. A lot of times you have to beg, but you get it. And then you have to combine that statistics, the data together in a certain way and run the data. So we did this study on cognitive exercises and MCI, mild cognitive impairment patients. And what we found was the most important thing is complexity, and I'll tell you what complexity means to me, and work around your weakness. So if you're getting older, and if you're having difficulty with memory, do memory games. There are three kinds of basic memory concepts: verbal, visual spatial, and procedural. Do the kind of activities that challenge that. If it's executive function, do things where it makes you think, makes you solve problems, executive problems. And so complexity is the key. So out of that study, we came up with three concepts at the core of building the brain. At the center of that is where you're supposed to live, at that target. Complexity. What does complexity mean? Complexity means activities that activate multiple parts of your brain. And that's not Sudoku. For those Sudoku fans out there. No, continue with your Sudoku, that's fine. But I'm talking about much more complex behaviors. Learning a musical instrument. Or if you're already playing a musical, learning new songs. Learning to dance. Learning to manage a job. Volunteering. Learning different languages. Building things. That's complexity. We had a patient, a VA veteran, who was having significant problem with his memory. He was 65. tremendous. And he also had some depression. He also some anxiety and was very, and when he was young, prior to going to the military, he loved fixing cars. Loved fixing cars. Then went to the military, and when he came out, he started working for a big company. I can't name it. And they made him do the same thing in the cars. So we thought, cars, right? That's good. But he was doing the same thing over and over again. Muffler, 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 muffler. And at 65, he was just besides himself. He came to me and said, I think it's time to retire. And we gave him some advice. He was gone for 6 months, came back. We did the testing, back to normal, cognitively, emotionally, in every sense. And his cognition was quite down, back to normal. So I said, what did you do? Did you change your diet? No, sorry, I didn't change my diet. Did you exercise? No. What did you do? This guy who hated his job with the car dealership, right, with car fixing, right? Guess what he was doing? He went back to his home, started fixing cars in his garage. Why? He did it in his own terms. He did the way he wanted to do it. He loved every aspect of it. And that changed everything. So complex activities like that was more executive function. Playing a musical instrument. Ayesha is an amazing singer, along with my daughter. I'm the worst musician in the history of mankind. I played guitar for 30 years. I've, I think, gone one song, Stairway to Heaven, but I'm on third staircase, not past that. It's terrible. But I love it because it's the act, it's the repetition. Let's take music, playing a guitar. When you're playing your instrument, you're reading the notes. That's your left parietal. That's your language centers, your Wernicke's and Broca's being challenged. You're processing it. It's your frontal lobe. You're being creative. It's your right parietal lobe. You're visually processing it. It's your occipital lobe. You're emotionally processing it. So motor cortex, cerebellum with coordination, and emotionally processing it because you're emotionally involved. That's the entire brain. That's no Sudoku. That's a brain on fire. You can see how a complex behavior like that can build a brain. So you don't have to buy another gimmick. You don't have to follow a little dot on a screen because somebody said that you need to follow these dots. Get involved. Social activity. My mother's going to be very mad if she sees some of these. So my mother was all into this chess champion, this, that. All of a sudden, now she's 83. Every night there's a gathering in her home with her age-matched women. And they're playing cards for quarters. First of all, I told her that's illegal, but she didn't care. But look at that. So people playing cards, the act of learning how cards are played, processing that, the conversations, sometimes cheating, that takes a lot of activity. That's mental activity, not Sudoku, not sitting in a corner. Social activity, volunteering, learning to dance even adds the coordination component. You got to see my dancing. That's even worse than my guitar. So that's mental activity. This is not joke. This is not, if I had to do one thing at community levels, would be to involve communities into groups, get them involved in other activities with other people, give them a purpose beyond self and in the community. That's by far the most effective way that you can actually maintain the cognition. The earlier, the better, by the way. Challenge means if you're doing something complex but it's repetitive, it's not good for the brain because it's repetitive. So you only know where the next challenge is. If you've picked up the guitar and you know 3 chords, now it's time for the 4th chord. If you're dancing and all you know is 3 moves, it's time for the 4th move. If you're learning languages like French, like I did in high school, and you only knew 20 words to go to a restaurant and for dating or whatever, it's time to go beyond that, how to maneuver through Louvre instead of the cafes. Move the next, challenge yourself, and only you know that. A computer is not going to tell you that. Only you know that. So do real life stuff. The third and the most important one comes to positive stress, purpose. If that activity does not serve some kind of purpose, it becomes stressful. And I don't mean purpose being something like saving the rainforest, although that would be good. But it would be simple things. My purpose is I want to learn to play a few songs on the guitar. That's a good purpose. My purpose is to help some people in my neighborhood. But that kind of a direction or vector is what will help us with mental activity. So complexity, challenge, and purpose are central. And we talked about all of those. And then habits. Very quickly about habits. We don't talk about just the science. If we just throw this at you, we've created failure, which is what doctors always do. Doctors are never taught two very important things. One is lifestyle, which is prevention, because it's disease model, it's not prevention model. It's sick care, it's not health care. The second thing they're not thought about is behavior modification. Just do it. I did it. It's incredible arrogance. Everybody's got their own journey, but this is what you do. Pick one specific behavior. This acronym is my favorite. It's very childish, very early in business, and all. SMART goals. How many people here know about SMART goals? Yes. Specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. I'm going to be healthy this year. What does that mean? You're probably going to end up less healthy because of that kind of a goal. I'm going to lose weight. What does that mean? You're going to probably gain weight because of that, the New Year resolution. I'm going to reduce sugar levels by 50% over the next 6 weeks. Is it specific, sugar? Is it measurable, 50%? Is it attainable? I think I can reduce it by 50%. Is it relevant to the bigger goal of health? Yes, because that pulls you. That's the motivation. Is it time-bound, 6 weeks? Only do that. You didn't get to the unhealthy state overnight. Don't try to get out of it overnight. And when you do this, you actually rebuild habits. Now, let me tell you about habits. Our brain, the 1 percentile that we use, is all repetitive behavior habits. Even when you think you're thinking, you're actually using what they call habit loops. Why? Because that's a lower energy state. Thinking outside of the box is high energy state. So your brain wants to be in the lower energy state. So habits are critical. But guess when you developed all these habits? During your teenage life. Do you really want to live with your teenage habits? So it's time to reprogram them, but one habit at a time. And when you do so, you actually recreate pathways in your basal ganglia. And after you recreate several of them, that becomes a highway where habits become a norm, habit building. But take one habit at a time. Here's my least favorite word in English language. The second least favorite is moderation, which is basically a doorway to failure. Anybody who wants to fail their diet, I'm doing it in moderation. What does that mean? So forget about that. But my least favorite word is motivation. Anybody who says you just got to be motivated, they're saying that I'm motivated and you're a loser. It means nothing. So motivation is actually a physiological process that I've defined. I gave a talk on this in the Harvard Business School. When you have a SMART goal in front of you, SMART, specific, measurable, and you only know what the steps should be. Steps that are achievable and successful. Your brain is a success-seeking machine. Then the next function of the brain is language, but it has two broad language terms. I like it, I don't like it. So as you make these successes, slowly after a while, not 21 days, I know everybody's doing a 21 day something, depends on the behavior. You know, you're not gonna give up cocaine in 21 days. I'm not saying anybody here is doing that, or you're not gonna give up sugar for 21 days. And initially, in fact, you're going to feel worse. Everybody says, oh, this is terrible, it's failing me. Yeah, because you're having withdrawals. Sugar is addictive. But then after a couple of months, depending on the person and their proclivity, some of us have more sugar addiction in the past. No, yeah. But it's going to take you longer. But that success, as you build that success, initially pain, but after a while, your brain comes up with this emotion. I like it. I like it. That has a vector. That has a direction. That's motivation. That's where behavior change can take place. Specific goals, successes, and then stick to one behavior, then add another behavior, and maybe next time it's cheese. Find replacement cheese that have low fat, low cholesterol. And then maybe exercise. Start with 5 minutes of brisk walk. That's it. So that's critical that we start that way. Our work is in the community. We have a clinic, Alzheimer's prevention program. We also have the biggest research program in the country at the beach cities, Manhattan Beach, Redondo Beach, Hermosa Beach, where the entire community is doing brain health initiative, and 1,700 people in this study. And all our profits from our books and other things go to our Healthy Minds initiative to raise awareness about the power of the community to take care of itself. And we have several other places that we're doing this. This is our book. And that's us. And you can connect to us through social media.
We'd be happy to connect with you through our website, teamsherzai.com. If you go to our website, we actually have a free brain health assessment test available where you can take a test finding out where you are in your journey towards better brain health. And you can fill out the questions to get information on nutrition, exercise, stress management, restorative sleep, and optimization. Thank you so much for your attention. We really appreciate being here.